Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Provenance Stories, connected with the Frick Art Reference Library. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this program has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Michelle McCarthy-Beeler, and I'm the reference librarian at the Frick Art Reference Library. We're so excited to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, Provenance Stories, where we'll discuss 3 paintings whose ownership histories were discovered with help from resources here at the Frick Art Reference Library. In addition to the stories today, we'll also be taking questions from you with the help of my colleague, Eugenie Fortier. Eugenie, would you like to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eugenie Fortier. I'm a reference assistant at the Frick Art Reference Library. I'll be moderating the Q&A throughout the session today to answer any immediate concerns. I'll also return at the end of the presentation to post any questions to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Eugenie. So let's get started and take a look at today's schedule. First, we'll get started with the introduction, which is what we're doing right now. Today, we'll be discussing the narrative ownership histories of 3 paintings: Landscape with a Footbridge by Jacob van Ruisdael, Damenbildnis an Fass by Gustav Klimt, and Girl from the Sabine Mountains by Franz Xaver Winterhalter. We'll also be highlighting important provenance resources at the library that allowed staff and the researchers working on these cases to discover these incredible histories as we go through them, and at the end of the presentation, where we'll also highlight some free online tools that you can use for your own research. And then we'll close with a brief 10 to 15 minutes Q&A at the end of the program. I also want to mention that these stories have been compiled over the years by staff here at the Frick Art Reference Library. And I want to particularly thank our colleagues from the library, Louisa Wood-Ruby and Inga Riest, for the work and guidance they've contributed on provenance and also on these stories especially. They've spoken publicly about them before, so we're really happy to have the chance to share them with you today as well. The first provenance story deals with this painting, entitled Landscape with a Footbridge, by the preeminent Dutch landscape painter of the 17th century, Jacob van Ruisdael. The painting was acquired by the Frick collection through a sale from Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild after World War II in 1949. And we can see the painting itself was completed in 1652. Here is a brief visualized timeline of provenance history for the Ruisdael that we'll go over today. Starting on the left-hand side from point 1, from its purchase in 1873 by the patriarch of the Viennese branch of the esteemed banking dynasty, the Rothschild family, the Baron Albert von Rothschild, to its inheritance by his son in point 2, Baron Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, after he passed away in 1911. And then from there, its tumultuous journey, beginning with the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and its subsequent confiscation by the Nazis, in which Hitler hand-chose it for his proposed Führer Museum, to when it was restituted by the Monuments Men to Louis Nathaniel after the war, and then finally when it's purchased by the Frick from Louis Nathaniel himself in 1949. So why was this painting confiscated? And who was Jacob van Ruisdael? Jacob van Ruisdael was one of the most prolific landscape painters of the Dutch Golden Age, who lived from about 1628 to 1682. According to curatorial staff and references here at the Frick, Ruisdael painted this while visiting a province near the Dutch-German frontier in the 1650s. In Landscape with a Footbridge, we can see a very realistic treatment of nature in the large gnarled oak tree on the left and in the clouds in the sky. According to curatorial commentary, the figures walking on the path here were also added by another artist, which was not an uncommon practice for Ruisdael. We're illustrating this because if you're researching an artwork held in an institution, it's a great idea to start with the object itself by finding reference to the artwork in the institution's online catalog or perhaps institutional records, as I've done here, where one can see images of the item and a listing of its provenance and curatorial information about the work. For Landscape with a Footbridge by Ruysdael, one can find this information in the art section of the frick.org website, where you can browse images from the collection alongside curatorial commentary. Fast forward several hundred years, and Ruysdael's ability to portray the beauty of natural phenomena continued to attract important collectors well into the 19th and 20th century, one of which was the Baron Albert von Rothschild, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the head of the Viennese branch of the Rothschild banking family. The Rothschilds have an incredibly long and interesting history, beginning with the patriarch who founded the international banking dynasty in Frankfurt, Germany in the 18th century, Meyer Amschel Rothschild. His portrait is on the left-hand side. Meyer became a dealer in rare coins, and his business grew to include a number of princely patrons. His sons and descendants furthered what was referred to as the 5 arrows of the international banking business. One son moved to Vienna, another to London, another to Paris, one in Naples, and one stayed in Frankfurt and looked over that branch from their father. Together, the family was able to finance and assist many varied industries across Europe and received great notoriety. Albert von Rothschild, pictured in the center, and his son, Louis Nathaniel, pictured at right, were descendants of the Viennese branch created by one of Meyer Amschel Rothschild's sons. Since we know that the Frick acquired the Ruysdael from Louis Nathaniel on the right, we must work backwards to find out more information on perhaps how it came into his and his father's possession, as well as what happened to it during the Second World War. Using the provenance information provided by an institution as a map with which to work backwards, one can use dates given to find relevant auction catalogs where the painting may have been acquired by a collector. For example, using the vast amount of collection catalogs available through the Frick Art Reference Library and its resources, such as the one pictured here at left, we can presume that Baron Albert von Rothschild acquired this Ruysdael from an auction held in Paris, dated March 27th to the 28th, 1873, by the Drouot auction firm. Pictured in the center, we can see a historical photo of the Drouot auction firm, where Albert may have purchased the work. Looking at the title page on the left-hand side again, we can also see that the auction specifically centered on the collection of an Art Papin and focused on paintings by the principal masters of the Dutch, Flemish, and French schools, as well as of the modern school. So auction catalogs are also a great way to understand perhaps other paintings or artworks that a collector may have purchased. The contents of the catalog also provide us with further information on the painting itself, and one can see a reproduction of the painting on the right. But particularly, I want to draw your attention to the annotations that one should always keep an eye out for when looking at auction catalogs and price lists. You can see them added here in penmanship on the left-hand page next to the type. These can sometimes include information on the purchase and/or the buyer. For instance, here, although we don't see Rothschild's name, we can see that this painting was acquired from this auction for 61,000 francs, presumably by Rothschild. Although Baron Albert von Rothschild passed away in 1911, we know that his art collection and his mansion passed to his son, Baron Louis Nathaniel, around that time. Louis Nathaniel became in charge of managing the family firm in Vienna and played an active role in newly acquired iron and engineering partnerships. He was also a catalyst for bridging the divide between the family branches that had grown apart as the business grew. Unfortunately, Louis Nathaniel had the painting for less than 30 years before the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March of 1938. Here we can see a photo of pro-National Socialist propaganda covering the streets of Vienna just 1 month after its annexation in April 1938. For years prior to the annexation and before Nazi Germany began occupying other countries, Nazi officials had made countless visits throughout Europe to well-known art collections, both private and public, in order to note the location of certain works of art so they could loot them upon invasion or annexation. In Nazi Germany, many paintings were collected, those that identified or exemplified the values of the Reich, but also those that could be sold to finance the Nazi war machine. After the annexation, Baron Louis Nathaniel was arrested trying to escape on a flight out of Austria and was taken into custody as a member of the Jewish elite. The Nazis had already targeted certain families for their collections and their money. Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's head of the secret police, the SS, pictured on the left, visited Rothschild in a very interesting story while he was in prison as an intimidation and negotiation technique, but was so impressed with his refinement and demeanor that Himmler actually ordered that Rothschild's living arrangements be improved and that he be taken to Hotel Metropole for the duration of his imprisonment. Hotel Metropole, pictured in the center from an early 20th century book, was a famous luxury hotel in Vienna that the Gestapo took as their headquarters. Unfortunately, with the institution of anti-Semitic decrees and laws now designating Jews as second-class citizens, while at the Hotel Metropole, Nazi officials confiscated the Rothschild mansion from Louis Nathaniel. They also liquidated his branch investments and confiscated the immense art collection that he and his father had built. He remained in prison until at least July 1939, after the family property had been confiscated, and his relatives were forced to pay $21 million as ransom for his release. According to the Jewish Telegraph Service, this was the largest sum ever paid in ransom at the time, which was in 1939. Baron Louis Nathaniel immediately emigrated to Vermont in the United States and spent the rest of his life on a farm. The Ruysdaels' whereabouts during the war are unknown. However, it's believed that it was among those hand-chosen by Hitler himself to be a part of his proposed Führer Museum. The Führer Museum was to be the premier art museum in the Third Reich's New World Order, and those Hitler designated as its collections were kept in particular storage facilities, one of which was the Altusee salt mines, which were located east of the German-Austrian border. Here, in the photograph on the left, we can see Hitler at the storage facility with other Nazi officials perusing artwork stolen from collections and chosen by him specifically for his Führer Museum, which was to be built in his hometown of Linz, Austria. If we look closely, we can see the paintings stacked on a wooden frame, and we can also notice the documentation that appears to be stapled to the frame, perhaps making notes of the titles and artists, or perhaps names from the collections from which the works were taken. With the end of the Second World War and Nazi Germany defeated, however, the monuments men and women of the US Army, headed by curators, librarians, and artists, were able to identify and rescue millions of artworks, books, and other objects stolen by the Nazis to begin the long repatriation process back to their countries of origin. The Nazis kept meticulous records of the works of art as well as who they were stolen from, which the monuments men were able to use to repatriate them. Other countries also sent individuals to help until there were 345 monuments men and women in all. With the exception of the Ruysdael and a few others, unfortunately, the Baron never received most of his former belongings back. It's estimated that his collection alone may have comprised over 1,000 paintings. But in 1949, just 4 short years after the end of the Second World War, the Frick collection was contacted by art dealers and agents of the Rothschild family, Rosenberg and Steibel, regarding the sale of a Ruysdael painting. Looking at the institutional records of the museum and the library held by the Frick archives, we discovered that the director of the Frick collection at the time, Frederick Mortimer Clapp, wrote to Helen Clay Frick, Mr. Frick's daughter, alerting her that the Rothschilds specifically requested that all publicity concerning the purchase be kept low to protect the Rothschild family's privacy and, quote, the delicate situation in which they currently find themselves in Europe. Displayed here is a letter from Rosenberg and Steibel, dated January 1949, with background on the painting and its journey. It reads, "During the war, the Ruysdael, together with all other Rothschild treasures, was confiscated by the Germans. When it was found after the war, there were no records or references with it." He then continues to list the reference works that mention the painting in a separate sheet here on the right-hand side. As with auction catalogs, curatorial correspondence and institutional archival documents belonging to an artwork, such as those listed here, can provide us with rich information on the painting, as well as historical contextualization about post-war art acquisition. This, compiled with other documentation, can help researchers to understand the nature of artworks in transit during this period, especially those being sold by people whose collections were stolen or sold under duress. The next painting on our list is Damenbildnis an Fass, or Portrait of a Lady by Gustav Klimt, painted in 1898-1899. This portrait has a different story with a similar Nazi history and was restituted to heirs of the Altmann family in 2004 by order of the Austrian government. Here we have another visualized timeline of the painting, beginning with its purchase by Bernard Altmann in 1922 on the left-hand side in point 1, and then its confiscation by Nazi officials in 1938, again with the annexation of Austria in point 2, and its selling at auction to a very surprising collector just a few weeks after its confiscation in 1938, later that month, and then finally to its restitution to Altmann heirs in 2004. Damenbildnis an Fass was painted by the Austrian symbolist painter Gustav Klimt. Klimt was one of the founding members of the Vienna Secession movement, which was closely related to Art Nouveau and what some believe to be the beginning of modern art in Austria. We can see a glimpse of turn-of-the-century Vienna on the right-hand side. Klimt was well known for being a painter of women and was open at various points to public commissions and portraits for the Viennese high society. But in addition to the bourgeoisie and the public commissioned portraits, like the one of Sonja Nips at left, Klimt had an anonymous model, many anonymous models and lesser-known women, many with other types of jobs as well, to sit for him. These two portraits, a Viennese high society woman at left and an anonymous woman at right, were painted in a similar time frame, just before the start of Klimt's golden phase, which included the famed portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer and Judith I. The portrait of the anonymous model in Damenbildnis an Fass is a bust with no reference to background and was painted from a very unusual angle, looking up at her face, and no way to guess who she is. Although Klimt scholars have speculated as to what her identity might be and who she is, the sitter is still unknown. What we do know about the painting, however, is that it was purchased at a sale at Wawra Auction House in Vienna by a man named Bernard Altmann, pictured on the right-hand side, in 1922. The sale catalog for the auction is located on the left-hand side, and we can see that it's centered on the collection of a man named Julius Reich if we look all the way to the left on the title page. The Klimt is circled in red next to the arrow. While we're not able to see any annotations in this auction catalog as with the previous ones that we've seen, researchers working on this case were able to find this auction catalog using documentation related to Altmann himself. Bernard Altmann was a Jewish Austrian textile manufacturer who entered the industry in 1915 and founded his own very successful knitwear manufacturing company in 1919. In 1938, when the Nazis annexed Austria, Bernard escaped to England from Vienna, to where he tried to make connections to build a factory and move his business and his family there. He then went to Paris to find a way to bring his family out of Vienna. His brother, Friedrich Altmann, by this time had already been taken to court by Nazi officials in order to coerce him into giving them his belongings in return for his freedom. Without trial, the Nazi officials took away all the family's possessions while Bernard was out of the country. While Bernard was able to help several family members out of the country at this point, his brother, Friedrich, was sent to Dachau concentration camp for several weeks and then brought back to Vienna, where he was put under house arrest for 3 more months until the Nazi negotiated more of the family's property from Bernard. Using Fold 3 Holocaust records from the National Archives found online via Ancestry.com, we could find Friedrich's name and birth dates in the list of Dachau prisoner ledgers on the upper right-hand side. And if Friedrich made any property claims after the war, we would be able to find those there as well. So we can see Friedrich's name circled in red with the arrow. And then a modern day photograph of Dachau concentration camp in the bottom. Unfortunately, in negotiating the return of his brother and over 24 relatives out of Austria, Bernard gave away all of his artwork and belongings to the Nazi officials, and his business was taken over and Aryanized. While in England, Bernard had to abandon his factory also shortly after due to the bombing of London and the UK Enemy Act of 1939, and emigrated to the United States. First to Massachusetts, then New York City, and then finally to Texas, where he started a successful cashmere company after the war. Along with other works of art and belongings of Altmann, Damenbildnis an Fass was auctioned less than 3 weeks after it was confiscated. The sale was held through the Dorotheum, one of the most famous auction houses in Europe. The Dorotheum at this time was Aryanized during the German occupation, and many sales made under duress were held there. This is the catalog in question, where, looking at the title page on the upper right-hand corner, you can clearly see the swastika in the upper left-hand corner of that page, as well as the listing for the Klimt piece in the centerpiece. In addition to pictures, period and utility furniture, the sale also included everything from chandeliers to table and bed linen, clothes, shoes, and everyday objects. And we can see on the left-hand side, there's just a lithograph of the Dorotheum. In a very interesting turn of events, the portrait was actually purchased during this 1938 sale by Gustav Usszucki, one of Gustav Klimt's recognized but illegitimate sons. Usszucki's mother, Maria, had been one of Klimt's models during the period when Klimt painted Damenbildnis an Fass, and Usszucki became a premier collector of his father's works. He was also a very famous Austrian film director whose work was highly praised before and during the Nazis, and his films were often screened during the Third Reich's 13-year reign. His collection of Klimts was coveted by many institutions. Upon his death in 1961, he bequeathed the portrait to the Österreichische Gallery in Vienna, a collection very well known for their holdings of Klimt artworks. And that's where it remained until it was restituted later. In light of the Holocaust Claims Conferences of 1998 and thereafter, American and European countries alike began investigating their collections and understanding the importance of post-World War II restitution research. Many families and researchers looking at collections stolen or sold under duress during the Nazi regime in occupied territories, for example. A researcher who was responsible for investigating the Altmann family collection visited the Frick Art Reference Library and specifically consulted the catalogs of auctions from which Altmann acquired the missing works, including the 1922 Wavre auction that we saw earlier, as well as other art reference works, such as exhibition catalogs where the portrait could have also been displayed, and also catalog raisonnés for the artist. They were also able to make an argument to the Austrian Minister of Culture to reclaim Damenbildnis an Fass from the Österreichische Gallery in Vienna using this information. Additionally, the auction catalogs also helped the Altmann family to locate other paintings that later were identified in public and private collections, and that were also returned to the family after over 60 years. The final provenance story for today is The Girl from the Sabine Mountains, painted in the mid-19th century by the artist Franz Xaver Winterhalter. This visualized timeline illustrates the tumultuous confiscation and restitution history of the painting's 20th century Jewish owner, Max Stern. From Max Stern's inheritance of his father's art gallery, Gallery Stern, in Dusseldorf, Germany, all the way on the left in point 1, to his first notice from Nazi government's Chamber of Fine Arts that he's no longer permitted to sell art as a Jew in point 2, and its sale in 1937 by another auction house in point 3, followed by his subsequent emigration to Canada, and the painting's discovery in Rhode Island, which led to its final restitution in 2008, 70 years after the liquidation of Stern's gallery. This is an important case because it was a watershed event in Holocaust art restitution. It was the first to acknowledge that coercion and forced sale were invalid and are valid reasons for restitution rather than legitimacy. Franz Xaver Winterhalter was a painter and lithographer, best known for his portraits of royalty in the mid-19th century. Born in Baden, Germany, he began studying drawing when he was 13 years old. Winterhalter entered court circles around 1828 and further established himself beyond Germany when he was able to travel to Italy in 1833 and 1834 with the support of Grand Duke Leopold of Baden. After spending time in Italy, he eventually joined the circles of the French Royal Academy and decided to move to Paris, where he maintained a successful career as a portraitist and genre painter. His royal sitters included Queen Victoria, as well as Maximilian I of Mexico during the Second Mexican Empire in the 1860s. Winterhalter painted this portrait of an Italian peasant girl entitled Girl from the Sabine Mountains while visiting Italy in the 1830s. This painting shows a woman wearing a local dress with a white blouse and an apron thick enough to withstand the daily grind. At this time in his career, his production was essentially made up of landscapes and genre scenes that depict the daily life of visitors. This information on the artist and on the artwork can be found in catalog raisonnés devoted to the artist, as well as monographs that can provide historical contextualization and subject specialization on the artist. In 1913, Julius Stern founded the Gallery Julius Stern in Dusseldorf, Germany, which began as an art dealership before becoming an auction house in 1931. We can see it pictured here on the left-hand side. Upon his father's death in 1934, their son Max Stern, who had just finished his dissertation, inherited the gallery. On the right-hand side, we can see a photo of Max Stern from 1925. Unfortunately, the year before, in 1933, the Reichskulturkammer, or the Reich Chamber of Culture, was created by the Nazi government and was part of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, which was headed by Joseph Goebbels. Due to racial reasons, Gallery Stern was forbidden to hold auctions, and in 1935, they received a letter from the president of the Reichs Chamber of Culture in Berlin informing Stern that he did not fulfill the requirements for membership. He was given 4 weeks to sell or dissolve his business, according to the Max Stern estate. Max Stern placed several appeals to the government, and they ended up giving him 3 months to sell his gallery. He was actually advised to sell the cultural property in his possession through an art dealer or auctioneer who was a member of the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts, most likely a Nazi official or a party member in some way. This is the catalog from an auction called Kunsthaus Lempertz that was located in Cologne, Germany. As you can see, Gallery Stern is not located anywhere in this catalog, if you want to take a moment just to look over it. The Nazi government put the Kunsthaus Lempertz in charge of Gallery Stern's affairs and liquidated its inventory in 1937. Stern himself was forced to inventory the gallery's entire collection in preparation for this forced sale, and he consigned the bulk of the gallery's inventory to the Kunsthaus Lempertz. So here we can see in the center there, circled, we have the Winterhalter and the Girl from the Sabine Mountains listing in the center, and then on the right-hand side, as we've seen with other auction catalogs, a reproduction on the artwork on the right. Stern never saw revenue from the Lempertz sale. But when he left Dusseldorf for London later that year in 1937, German authorities froze his assets, and less than a year later, they forced him to relinquish them in return for an exit visa for his mother. Stern escaped Nazi Germany for London in 1937. So here we have a little bit of a map. We have a little bit of a ledger down on the bottom there that you can see. It's annotated by color, Max Stern's emigration out of Germany to the UK, and then from London, where he's in the UK, he goes to Montreal, or very close to Montreal, he goes to Canada. While he was in London in 1940, Scotland Yard began detaining German and Austrian citizens and incarcerating them as enemy aliens. Stern was sent to an internment camp, but he did volunteer to join a group that was actually being sent to Canada, which is where he was able to cross the Atlantic. While in the Canadian internment camp, Stern volunteered to teach classes because of his very bright and outgoing personality, and he actually caught the attention of the head of the National Committee on Refugees, a man named William Birks. And in 1941, Birks sponsored both Stern's release from the internment camp and his move to Montreal, and also put him in touch with an art dealer there who owned a gallery there called Dominion Gallery of Fine Art. Stern began working on the gallery, which we can see pictured at left, and shortly became a partner after only a few years. On the right-hand side, we can see a slightly more aged Max Stern in another photo. In 1947, Stern and his wife purchased the gallery, and he became one of the only dealers at the time to focus on contemporary Canadian artists. He also built a very strong reputation for modern and early masters. According to the Stern estate, Stern often cautioned his clients to avoid making purchases at auction houses where paintings or artworks' provenances were often not fully revealed or obscured in some way. He attempted to find out about the collection that he had been liquidated or that he had helped liquidated, or rather been forced to liquidate from Gallery Stern in 1937, but unfortunately no one ever came forward with the artwork to return to him while he was alive. The gallery itself lasted another 13 years after his death, but when it was time for the Dominion Gallery to shut down and its assets to be liquidated, the estate began reaching out to European art dealers and began also to draw connections between Dusseldorf's Gallery Stern and Max Stern due to an upsurge in Holocaust claims, and a lot of European dealers were also interested in seeing if there was a connection between the two. After studying Max Stern's private papers, estate executives were able to confirm that he was in fact related to Gallery Julius Stern from Dusseldorf. Now, what happened to the painting? Off the market for 68 years, Winterhalter's Girl from the Sabine Mountains was consigned to a small Rhode Island auction house by an 80-year-old German baroness who lived in Providence in 2005. It turned out from the Gallery Stern Lempert sale in 1937, her stepfather Karl Wilhelm had purchased the painting for a discounted price in Cologne. She then inherited it from her mother, and then in 2005 was when she hired the small estate firm to sell it for her. So that's quite a journey from 1937 Dusseldorf and Cologne. A label was discovered on the back of the painting, indicating that it had previously been sold in the 1937 Lempert sale in Cologne. And researchers visited the Frick Art Reference Library to find out more information about the auction in question. It was using the auction catalogs from auctions by the Nazis and catalog raisonnés for the artist, all of which were consulted at the library, that the researchers were able to piece together the nature of the sale and contacted an organization called the Art Loss Register, which is an international art and historic claims department that deals with looted, stolen, and lost artwork about the painting's whereabouts. The Art Loss Register was then able to put out a list of Stern inventory from the Lempert sale, but also from just Stern, what he listed as objects that he had been missing since leaving Germany as well. On behalf of the Stern estate, the Art Loss Register's Historic Claims Department were able to identify the painting and actually ask the Baroness and ask the small estate sale to withdraw the painting from the sale. Unfortunately, the Baroness refused, claiming that she had inherited the work from her mother, and whose second husband, Karl Wilhelm, had purchased it at a completely legitimate 1937 Lempert sale. She also offered his bill of sale as an evidence that the work was hers, since she said there was no proof that it was a forced sale. But with all of the information that we have on Max Stern, his immigration, the nature of Gallery Stern, the letters that he received from the German government at the time, she did lose the appeal in 2008, and the painting was restituted to the Max Stern estate. So the Frick Art Reference Library continues to aid in provenance and restitution research through its extensive reference resources. We're going to also make sure to drop a link to each one of these in the chat as we go through them where applicable. But just in a little bit of a review, auction catalogs, such as the one we've seen here today in this presentation, are vital for documenting the provenance of artworks that were stolen or looted, some of which are from places such as Switzerland and France during the war, other occupied territories, and some are from Germany itself. Also, catalog raisonnés and monographs. The library has a very large number of these. Catalog raisonnés are comprehensive annotated listings of all known artworks by a particular artist, either in a particular medium or in all media, that can really help pinpoint provenance information at the time of its publication. And then modern art catalog raisonnés also include exhibition history and literature references that you can also confirm other items about the painting, details about it. Also, monographs, which are single specialized studies that can focus on an artist's biography or perhaps a national history, such as in this time period specifically, can also be very helpful in supplemental information. Exhibition catalogs and checklists. The library also holds very rare exhibition checklists of the items included in exhibition catalogs, many of which are from Jewish dealers in Paris who were liquidated and/or Aryanized during the war. This is really helpful in understanding, again, the transit of artwork. All of these resources can be found through our public access catalog at the Frick called Fresco, and we're going to drop a link to our Fresco open public catalog record right there in the chat. The Frick Art Reference Library's photo archive is another invaluable resource because it documents information about privately owned works. The photo archive began with photo expeditions in Europe and America and was started by Helen Clay Frick, the library's founder and the daughter of Henry Clay Frick in the 1920s, and has since been incredibly useful in various provenance capacities. But one of the many ways has been in helping to construct provenance information dealing with photographed artworks. It's also one of the first image collections of its time. Next, we have the Archives Directory for the History of Collecting in America, which is a resource constructed by the Center for the History of Collecting here at the Frick, which helps researchers locate primary source material about American art collectors, dealers, agents, and advisors, and the repositories that hold these records. This can be particularly useful when trying to construct the ownership history of collectors who perhaps escaped the Third Reich and immigrated to America and were able to build collections here, or maybe who had correspondence perhaps with those who were still trapped in Europe or who were still operating in Europe at the time. And next, as we saw from earlier examples, we have the Frick Collection and the Frick Art Reference Library archives. Institutional archives can really provide us with internal documentation and details regarding works of art, from purchasing and accession dates to notable reference works that include the item for further information. Not all of these are open to the public, of course. There are certain privacy reasons that must be upheld, but there are many institutions, including the Frick, who do have digitized material and finding aids available online that you can also contact the archives and perhaps when the library reopens, make appointments to see it and whatnot. Finally, we have some additional World War II era provenance resources. These are some other online resources that are very useful in World War II provenance. We won't be doing demonstrations of these here, but we did do a webinar this past May entitled World War II Provenance Online Resources, free web resources that you can find a recording of in the Interact section of the frick.org website. First, we do have these linked here as well, so we'll drop these in the chat. The first one we have is the Central Registry for Information on Looted Cultural Property, which is a comprehensive repository of information devoted to Nazi looting and contemporary efforts and research to resolve all outstanding claims issues. The website has a wealth of international and country-specific information and resources that are a great way to stay up to date with current research and restitution information. Next, we have the International Research Portal for Records Related to Nazi-Era Cultural Property, which is an international collaboration of archival institutions with holdings about Nazi-era cultural property. It exists to expand public access to archival records that have been internationally dispersed at various institutions through a single portal. I will say that the archives in here are incredibly important. If you do find them, they may not be digitized, but you can always contact the institution that holds them and see if you can order some reproductions if you're working on a case yourself. Next, we have the German Lost Art Database, which documents cultural assets that were confiscated from public institutions and private collections during the Nazi era in Germany. And what's interesting about this resource is that it lists search requests of people who or institutions who are looking for artworks that may have been stolen or confiscated during this time period, but it also includes the ability to submit found reports if you have items in your collection that you can't find the provenance for those years. You're able to submit a profile for the item to the Lost Art database, and then maybe somebody can contact you to see if it matches their collection as well. And then finally, we have the Getty Provenance Index, which is just a great resource for provenance research in general, but it also includes German sales catalogs from 1900 to 1945. And along with a few other institutions, it locates, digitizes, and adds to the index all German language auction catalogs from the Nazi era, from about 1930 to 45, that you can access for free, digitized directly from your home. And then last but not least, we have Fold 3 National Archives military records. This is a great resource, which I know earlier I said is from Ancestry.com. And it's really interesting because it provides access to really important military records that aren't just US based, actually. It also includes over 2.3 million pages also of Nazi administrative files, in addition to Allied administrative files. The only stipulation is that users need to create a free account in order to access these digitized documents. So for instance, on Fold 3, you'll be able to find the paperwork that the Monuments Men and Women used, the Monuments Initiative used in order to repatriate materials and items back to their countries of origins, and also that might even list collectors' names. So that's always a great resource to use as another tool. So that's it for the presentation. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we're ready to move on to the Q&A portion of the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. Those were fascinating stories. The very first question that we have is more of a comment than a question. For the Winterhalter story, it would be good to consult the Stern Cooperation Project housed in the Central Institute in Munich, which also has many other provenance research projects that could help you refine some of the details of the Stern trajectory.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a really great resource as well. Thank you. I'm glad someone mentioned that.
Someone asked, what percentage of forced sales during World War II are still out there, meaning art that has not been returned to the original owner?
That's a good question. I don't have the figures myself, but it's definitely a very large amount. I think also, I mean, where these forced sales were actually absorbed from, who actually bought these materials is another matter. Not everyone has come forward yet, obviously. There's still many that are just still unaccounted for sales specifically. That's what I can think of. But there are many cases out there actually that are for sales. That's how a lot of the more wealthy families were able to trade their emigration or trade for visas, for example. In terms of art that had just been perhaps looted or perhaps had just been not accounted for, that were just lost during the war anyway through sales faced forced by the Nazis, or whether it's just through wartime efforts in general. I know that also there's a lot of something called Soviet trophy art as well. That's also something to look into. So a lot of artwork, is still unknown in different regions of Europe as well. That's a great question. Thank you.
There's actually a second part to that question, which is, do you know of any other large systematic forced sales since World War II? If so, what?
That is a really good question. I don't know of any later than that, but that's definitely a research problem for upcoming.
Oh, definitely. We have had several comments that the Winterhalter is actually currently being sold by the Mark Stern estate through Robert Simon Fine Art.
Yes, it is. Yes, that's true. Mm-hmm.
The following question is, would you please elaborate on why the Winterhalter case was a watershed restitution moment?
So the Winterhalter is considered a watershed restitution moment because prior to the Winterhalter case, World War II provenance has really been developing in the last few years, the last 20 years or so. And I think that it's very complicated, a lot of these cases, because of different litigations between countries, different relationships, different legal entities. So they're always just very difficult and complicated cases. But I think the Winterhalter in particular is because it was the first one that was able to say that the sale was made under duress, because otherwise the Lempert sale, for example, the catalog that we saw in this presentation, for example, you don't see Gallery Stern written anywhere on there. So you're not really able to prove just by that, or even a bill of sale, as the Baroness at the time had tried to do from that Lempert sale that her stepfather had bought it from, using that it was a forced sale, because to them it looked completely legitimate. However, if you're going to look at the background, the backstory, so you were able to find Gallery Stern, Max Stern, and kind of understand that he helped create this inventory, which we're actually able to know, and I didn't include this in the presentation, but we're able to know this. The Max Stern estate says it's because when Max Stern actually fled to England, he was able to create another inventory of his works there, because he thought he would be getting the works back, or he didn't realize that it would be the end of everything. And I think later in life, again, he tried to put out listings for the artworks that he lost in an attempt to gain them back, and was unsuccessful. But I think if you're able to look back at the person who the forced sale, or who the sale was forced on, or the person whose sale was made under duress, you'll be able to then connect their previous inventories. You'll be able to match other documentation. So in Max Stern's case, we can see that he had a variety of letters from the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts at the time, telling him that he was no longer permitted to sell artwork, and that he, needed to liquidate his inventory. He had this amount of months. So you can see, kind of through that, you're able to prove that it was a sale made under duress. But just looking at the catalog itself, and just looking at the bill of sale that the Baroness has had, or had at the time, it was very difficult.
Thank you. That was a great answer. All right, the following question is, are artworks usually discovered when current owners try to sell them? I'm assuming artworks that need to be restituted.
That's a good question. I think that's more in depth than I'm probably capable of answering myself. I think people who are working on provenance in the field can probably be a better measure of that. But you're welcome to email the library, library@frick.org, and maybe we can work on that question a little bit more together. But I think, again, that one could be case by case as well. Oh, and I also want to mention Robert Simon is going to be selling the Winterhalter, as we mentioned earlier in the questions, but there's also a correction. The Lempertz catalog actually does state that the contents of the Gallery Stern are being liquidated through that sale. So it is, I mean, that is proof as well that it was a sale made under duress. So thank you very much for that.
Great, thank you. I guess let's just wait a couple more minutes to see if a few more questions come in. But in the meantime, there have been a lot of thank yous in the chats, congratulatory comments on the presentation and the great graphics.
Perfect. Great. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. I will say, too, that this is just one of several provenance that the library and its partners have been conducting. So I definitely want to just let everybody know that we've been doing this while the Frick Library and the Frick Collection have been closed. The Frick Art Reference Library has been closed. So if you're interested in seeing any of our previous webinars, you can go to the frick.org website in the Interact page on the website, and you can see other recordings of past webinars that we've done, some of which are on provenance as well. So I just want to let everybody know about that if you're interested in learning a bit more.
Great. So we do have a couple additional questions. Were the auction houses forced to do sales, or did they oblige?
That's a really great question, and I think that's one that's debated a lot, especially at the end of the war. It's very hard to know. I think some of them are obviously very clear. A lot of them were probably, if they were members of the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts, we can, maybe assume that they did oblige, but we can't, again, I guess we can't really assume that. So it really depends on the circumstance. I will say that lootedart.com, or the Central Registry, which was one of the links that we dropped in the chat there, they have a list that was actually compiled, I believe, by Allied forces. It's a red flags list of individuals that they they interviewed after the war that they suspected may have played a role in smuggling art out of the country, or had been part of sales like this. So that's always a good place to start too. Again, that's the Central Registry of Looted Arts. That's lootedart.com if you're interested in that.
Great, thank you. What is the biggest challenge in this work?
That's a great one. I would say a lot of it can be pretty challenging. I think, sometimes it's easy if you're working with maybe a work that's very well known, or you're working with a collection that's very well known, or even a collector that's very well known. I think it's much easier when that's the case. But if you're talking about maybe a family that's lesser known, or maybe archival inventory that was destroyed during the war, that can be a big challenge. I think if we're talking about the past, that can be a big challenge. And then I think now the challenges, as we're kind of alluding to before, the challenge now can be also where to find these artworks. Many of them haven't surfaced yet. Robert Edsel, he's the historian and author of The Monuments Men. He's said multiple times that probably in the next 50 years, 100 years, maybe as the generations start shifting again, we'll start seeing more of an upsurge in these types of artworks. But it's very hard to find the biggest challenge for sure.
I can definitely see why. So we do have a couple additional questions that came in through the chat. What do you think will happen with African and other looted art?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find that question.
It's in the chat instead of the Q&A.
Oh, I see. Let's see. For African and other looted art, I think that's a very interesting question as well. I think for that, time will have to tell. it really depends on how the field develops a little bit more as well. I mean, a lot of this, we're not just talking about institutions. A lot of times we're also talking about countries. We're talking about international relations. So I think someone who does provenance often, that you have a lot of people who do it. Obviously, it's part of their jobs. I think they probably would have more to say about it than I would for sure. But I'm sure it's provenance seems, especially with restitution, seems to be very complicated.
Excellent. What organizations / websites are working with Soviet art restitution?
That's a great question. Let me see. I do know of one that was Soviet specific. I'm blanking on the name. Let me see if I can find it for you. But there was definitely one that's working on it's working on Soviet trophy art, and then specifically you have a few studies that are on by art restitution organizations who are working on art restitution for I know specifically Hungarian collections that had been looted at the time as well. Specific organizations, though, I'll have to find that for you. But if you want to email us, you can email library@frick.org, and I can send those to you directly. Or feel free to email me as well.
Great, thank you. I believe we have one. Oh, sorry.
No. Just to jump backwards, we have just another comment here in the Q&A and in the chat that legal frameworks in many countries do not require return. Very, very true. Thank you for putting that in.
Right. I guess one final question is, how do you see transparency or lack thereof in contemporary auction houses today?
That's a great question, too. Unfortunately, working in the library, we don't really get to see the insides like that as much. We help. What we can do as a library and as an art research center is we can provide resources with which to, as we've done for these cases here, provide information and allow them to, make these cases known and are able to provide them with information to find the owners and whatnot and kind of develop these histories. But as far as transparency in contemporary auction houses, that's a great question. But unfortunately, where we stand, we're not able to really see that. But we can provide all the resources as possible to hopefully make sure that transparency occurs 100%.
Right, that's the best we can hope for.
Absolutely.
I believe that's all the questions we have for today.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any further questions on art restitution or on any of the resources that we have here, please don't hesitate to contact us. My email is on the screen, but also definitely email our reference at library@frick.org, and we'll be able to get back to you about that and maybe put you in touch with some really great resources. We would just want to acknowledge that the program has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So thank you all so much for working with us today, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Take care and stay healthy.
Thanks, everyone.